Nobody knew what he would do until he saw his brother's body. Samuel Silent Sam McKenna had lived 43 years without raising his voice above a whisper, without drawing his gun in anger, without asking for anything from anyone. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek respected him the way you respect a sleeping mountain, quietly, from a distance, knowing that beneath the stillness lay something powerful and unpredictable. But on that cold October morning, when the undertaker's wagon rolled up to the McKenna ranch carrying what was left of his younger brother Thomas, something changed in Sam's gray eyes. The silence that had always been his strength became something else entirely, a loaded gun, cocked and ready. The widow Martha Collins watched from her porch as Sam stood motionless beside the wagon, his weathered hands trembling as they touched the rough pine coffin. She had seen men break before, seen them weep, rage, and crumble under the weight of loss. But Sam McKenna's grief was different. It was quiet, patient, and absolutely terrifying. What she didn't know was that this moment would unravel every lie Redemption Creek had been built on, starting with the badge hanging on Sheriff Clayton's chest. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a valley between two weathered mesas, its main street a ribbon of dust that connected the church at one end to the saloon at the other. Between them stood the sheriff's office, the general store, the bank, and a handful of clapboard houses that had seen better decades. The wind here never stopped. It carried the scent of sage and distant rain, the sound of cattle bells, and secrets that should have stayed buried. The McKenna Ranch sprawled across the eastern slope, 500 acres of stubborn grass and harder ground that Sam and Thomas had worked with their father until the old man died, and then worked together until now. The ranch house was simple but solid, built to last through prairie storms and prairie winters. A wide porch wrapped around the front, where Sam would sit in the evenings, watching the sun die behind the mesas while Thomas played his harmonica, the only sound Sam ever seemed to enjoy. Sam McKenna was the kind of man who spoke with his hands instead of his mouth. When he shook your hand, you felt calluses thick as leather and a grip that could crush stones. His face was carved from the same hard stone as the mesas, all sharp angles and deep lines etched by sun and wind. His hair, once black as a moonless night, had gone iron gray at the temples. But his eyes, those pale gray eyes, missed nothing and forgave less. Thomas had been different. Where Sam was stone, Thomas was water, flowing, adaptable, always finding the easy path. He could charm a rattlesnake into coiling up peaceful-like, could make even the preacher's wife laugh with his stories. Thomas talked enough for both brothers, his voice carrying across the valley when he called the cattle home. He was the music in Sam's silent world, the warmth in their cold house. The town saw them as a pair, the quiet one and the charming one, the muscle and the smile. But they didn't see the way Sam's eyes softened when Thomas played his harmonica, or how Thomas always deferred to his older brother when decisions needed making. They were two halves of the same whole, and now. Sheriff Clayton was a thick man who wore his badge like a crown, his guts straining against his vest buttons. He had small, quick eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke, and hands that were too soft for a man who claimed to have tamed the frontier. Clayton had been sheriff for 8 years, ever since he'd married the banker's daughter and found himself with friends in high places. He kept the peace by keeping his mouth shut about the right things and opening it about the wrong ones. Martha Collins was the town's only widow under 50, a woman who'd lost her husband to consumption 3 years back and her illusions about Redemption Creek shortly after. She lived in a small house behind the church, took in sewing, and watched everything with the sharp eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose. Martha had seen Sheriff Clayton talking to the banker at odd hours, had noticed which ranchers never seemed to have trouble with rustlers, had counted the times Thomas McKenna had ridden into town looking worried and ridden out looking scared. The town's other players moved through their daily routines like actors in a play that had been running too long. Doc Peterson with his shaking hands and his laudanum breath. Banker Harrington with his soft smile and his hard ledgers. Preacher Williams with his thunderous sermons and his quiet compromises. The saloon girls who knew everyone's business and pretended not to. The ranchers who gathered at the general store every morning to complain about the weather and the government, careful not to mention the real reason their cattle counts never matched what they sold. Redemption Creek was a town built on lies, held together by silence, and ruled by men who confused fear with respect. It was about to learn the difference. Sam and Thomas McKenna had never been just brothers, they'd been partners in everything. When their father died from a horse kick to the chest, leaving them with more debt than cattle, they'd worked 18-hour days to save the ranch. When rustlers hit their south pasture, they'd tracked them for 3 days through Apache country and brought back their stock without firing a shot. When the bank tried to foreclose during the drought of '84, they'd found a way to make their payments, no matter what it cost them. But something had changed in the months before Thomas died. Sam noticed it first in the way his brother's harmonica fell silent after supper, then in the way Thomas would ride into town alone, something he'd never done before. The easy smile that had always been Thomas's trademark began to look forced, painted on like the false fronts of the buildings on Main Street. "Everything all right, Tommy?" Sam had asked one evening, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He wasn't used to having to ask. Thomas had been cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp and agitated. "Just business, Sam. Nothing for you to worry about." But Sam McKenna was born to worry, especially about his brother. He'd started paying attention to things he'd previously ignored, the way people stopped talking when Thomas walked into the general store, the way Sheriff Clayton's eyes followed his brother down the street, the way Thomas's horse came back lathered and tired from trips that should have been easy rides. The problem, as Sam slowly pieced it together, had started with the cattle. Someone had been rustling stock from the smaller ranches, always just enough to hurt but not enough to ruin. The McKenna ranch had been hit twice, losing 15 head each time. Sheriff Clayton had made all the right noises about investigating, but somehow the trail always went cold at the county line. Thomas had been furious about the losses in a way that surprised Sam. They'd dealt with rustlers before, it was part of ranching, like bad weather and broken fences. But this time, Thomas had taken it personally. He'd started asking questions in town, talking to other ranchers who'd been hit, comparing notes about timing and methods. That's when the visits to town became frequent and secretive. Thomas would ride out after breakfast, saying he had business with the feed store or the blacksmith, but he'd come back with no grain and no horseshoes. His saddlebags would be empty, but his face would be full of something Sam had never seen there before, fear mixed with determination, like a man walking into a burning building because someone he loved was trapped inside. The ranchers had started treating Thomas differently too. Old Pete Garrison, who'd been buying McKenna cattle for 15 years, suddenly didn't need any stock. Miguel Santos, whose spread bordered theirs to the south, stopped coming by for their weekly chess games. Even Widow Collins, who'd always had a smile and a cup of coffee for Thomas, started watching him through her curtains instead of inviting him onto her porch. Sam had confronted his brother about it on a cold September evening, cornering him in the barn while Thomas was brushing down his horse. "Tommy, what's eating at you?" Thomas had stopped brushing, his hand resting on the horse's neck. In the lamplight, Sam could see how much weight his brother had lost, how the lines around his eyes had deepened. "You ever think about leaving this place, Sam? Going somewhere nobody knows our name?" The question had hit Sam like a physical blow. The ranch wasn't just their home, it was their identity, their legacy, their father's sweat and blood mixed with the soil. The idea of leaving was like asking him to stop breathing. "This is our home, Tommy. Our father's buried in that hill. His father before him. We don't run." Thomas had laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sometimes running is the only way to stay alive. That had been their last real conversation. 3 days later, Thomas rode into town and never came back. The horse returned at sunset, reins dragging, saddle empty. They found Thomas's body at dawn, face down in the creek that gave the town its name, a bullet hole in his back and his pockets turned inside out. Sheriff Clayton had called it a robbery gone wrong. Probably drifters, he'd said, not quite meeting Sam's eyes. They hit him for his money and panicked when he fought back. "We'll find them, Sam. You have my word." But Sam had seen enough robberies to know this wasn't one. Thomas never carried more than a few dollars, and his horse had been left untouched. No self-respecting outlaw would pass up a good horse. The gun was still in Thomas's holster, unfired. This wasn't random violence. This was execution. As Sam stood beside his brother's grave, listening to Preacher Williams mumble words about dust and ashes, he began to understand something that made his blood run cold. Thomas hadn't been killed by strangers. He'd been killed by someone who knew him, someone who knew exactly where to find him, someone who'd made sure he couldn't fight back. Someone in Redemption Creek had murdered his brother, and Sheriff Clayton was calling it a robbery. The question was whether Clayton was incompetent or complicit. Sam McKenna intended to find out. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of old pewter. The whole town came, as they always did when someone died, not out of love, but out of that peculiar mixture of curiosity and relief that comes from watching someone else's tragedy from a safe distance. They stood in their dark clothes around the fresh grave, whispering prayers and platitudes while Sam McKenna stood silent as a tombstone, his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on the pine box that held all that remained of his brother. Preacher Williams spoke about eternal rest and divine judgment, his voice carrying over the cemetery like wind through dry grass. But Sam wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the faces, studying each expression, memorizing every glance, cataloging who seemed genuinely sad and who was merely going through the motions. Sheriff Clayton stood near the back, his badge catching the gray light. He kept checking his pocket watch, as if he had somewhere more important to be than a murdered man's funeral. Banker Harrington was there with his wife, both of them looking properly somber but standing just a little too far away, as if death might be contagious. Doc Peterson swayed slightly on his feet, his hands shaking worse than usual. But it was Martha Collins who caught Sam's attention. She stood alone by the fence, her black dress sharp against the weathered wood, and she was watching Sheriff Clayton with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. When their eyes met across the cemetery, she nodded slightly, not the polite acknowledgement of shared grief, but something deeper. A recognition. An understanding that they both knew this wasn't over. After the last prayer was said and the last handful of dirt thrown, people began to drift away. Some stopped to offer Sam their condolences, awkward handshakes and muttered words about Thomas being a good man and gone too soon. Sam nodded to each of them, his face expressionless, his voice reduced to single syllables of acknowledgement. Sheriff Clayton approached last, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Real sorry about Thomas, Sam. He was a good man. We'll get the bastards who did this." Sam looked at him for a long moment, his gray eyes flat and unreadable. "Will you?" "You have my word on it." Clayton's voice was too loud, too eager. "Soon as we get word from the county seat, we'll start tracking them down. These drifters can't have gone far." Drifters. Sam repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. Had to be. Who else would? Sheriff. Sam's voice cut through Clayton's explanation like a blade. "My brother was shot in the back. Close range. His gun never left his holster. His horse was left behind, but his saddlebags were emptied. You tell me, What kind of drifter kills a man for his pocket change but leaves a $50 horse? Clayton's face flushed red above his collar. Now Sam, I know you're grieving, but… I'm not grieving. Sam's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. I'm thinking. And what I'm thinking is that whoever killed Thomas knew him. Knew where he'd be. Knew he wouldn't be expecting trouble. The sheriff's hand moved unconsciously toward his gun. You better be careful what you're suggesting, Sam. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. My brother was murdered by someone he trusted. Someone who knew his habits. Someone who wanted him dead for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Sam stepped closer, close enough that Clayton had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. Someone who's probably still in this town, walking around free while Thomas lies in the ground. Clayton's face had gone pale. You're upset. Not thinking clearly. Maybe you should go home, get some rest. Sam looked at him for another long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. But as he reached the cemetery gate, he paused and looked back. Martha Collins was still there, still watching, still waiting. Their eyes met again, and this time she mouthed two words that made Sam's blood run cold. I know. The breaking point wasn't Thomas's death. It was the realization that everyone in Redemption Creek knew more about his brother's murder than they were telling, and that the man wearing the badge was either the biggest fool in the territory or the most dangerous man in it. Sam McKenna had always been a patient man, but grief had transformed his patience into something else entirely, a cold, methodical determination that settled into his bones like winter frost. He didn't storm into the sheriff's office demanding answers. He didn't gather a posse or call for vigilante justice. Instead, he did what he'd always done best. He watched, he listened, and he waited. The first place he went was Thomas's room, which he'd avoided since the funeral. Everything was exactly as his brother had left it, clothes folded in the dresser, books stacked beside the bed, the harmonica sitting on the windowsill where Thomas always left it after playing. But Sam wasn't looking for memories. He was looking for evidence. He found it in the bottom drawer of Thomas's desk, hidden beneath a stack of old letters from their father. A leather journal, its pages filled with his brother's careful handwriting. Sam carried it to the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and began to read. The journal entries started 3 months before Thomas died. The first entries were about the cattle rustling, but they quickly became something more disturbing. Thomas had been keeping track of which ranches were hit and which were spared, noting the patterns that Sheriff Clayton had apparently missed. The Rodriguez spread, untouched. The Harrington place never lost a single head. The Collins Ranch, hit twice, both times right after Martha had complained about the sheriff's lack of action. But it was the later entries that made Sam's hands shake as he read them. Thomas had discovered something about the rustling operation, something that involved men he'd known all his life. Names were mentioned, some in code, some scratched out completely. There were references to the arrangement and the understanding and keeping the peace. And running through it all, like a thread of poison, was Sheriff Clayton's name. The last entry was dated the day before Thomas died. They know I know. Clayton came by the ranch today, asking questions about what I've been doing in town. Said he was worried about me, that I seemed troubled lately. Told me it might be better if I kept my concerns to myself, at least until after the election. Said a man could get hurt sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. I think he was trying to warn me. I think he was trying to save me. But I can't stop now. Too many people have been hurt. Too many lies have been told. If something happens to me, I hope Sam will understand why I had to do this. Sam closed the journal and sat in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of his brother's words settle over him like a shroud. Thomas had been trying to expose corruption in Redemption Creek, and it had gotten him killed. The question was, how deep did the corruption go? The next morning, Sam rode into town earlier than usual, his horse's hooves muffled by the dust of Main Street. He tied up in front of the general store and walked inside, nodding to Mrs. Patterson behind the counter. The store was empty except for old Pete Garrison, who was examining a new shipment of feed sacks. "Morning, Pete." Garrison looked up, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Sam, how you holding up?" "Getting by." Sam picked up a sack of coffee beans, turning it over in his hands. "Pete, I need to ask you something." "About Thomas." The old rancher's face went carefully blank. "What about him?" "He was asking questions before he died. About the rustling. About who was getting hit and who wasn't. Did he talk to you about it?" Pete set down the feed sack and rubbed his hands on his pants. "Sam, some questions are better left unasked." "Is that what you told Thomas?" "I told Thomas the same thing I'm telling you. A man can get hurt poking around where he doesn't belong. Your brother was a good man, but he was naive. He thought he could fix things that have been broken for years." Sam studied the old man's face. Pete Garrison had been ranching in this valley for 30 years, had survived droughts and rustlers and bank foreclosures. He wasn't the type to scare easy. "What kind of things, Pete?" Garrison looked around the store, making sure they were alone. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind of things that keep certain people in power and certain other people quiet. The kind of things that make sure the right cattle disappear from the right ranches at the right times. The kind of things that ensure some folks never have to worry about their loans being called in, while others lose everything they've worked for." "You're talking about Sheriff Clayton." "I'm not talking about anybody. I'm telling you to be smart, Sam. Smarter than your brother was. Thomas thought he could expose the truth and change things. All he did was get himself killed." Sam bought the coffee and left the store, but Pete's words followed him like shadows. He spent the rest of the day visiting other ranchers, asking careful questions, listening to what they said and what they didn't say. The picture that emerged was darker than he'd imagined. Redemption Creek wasn't just dealing with ordinary rustlers. There was an organized operation, protected by people in positions of authority, that was systematically stealing from small ranchers and selling their cattle through legitimate channels. The profits were being split between the thieves and their protectors, while the victims were left to struggle or lose their spreads entirely. Thomas had figured it out, had started gathering evidence, and had been killed for it. But he hadn't been working alone. As Sam rode home that evening, he found Martha Collins waiting for him on his porch, her black dress stark against the weathered wood. "Mrs. Collins. We need to talk, Sam. About Thomas. About what he was trying to do. About what got him killed." Sam dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "I'm listening." Martha pulled a folded paper from her sleeve and handed it to him. It was a letter, written in Thomas's careful handwriting. "He gave me this the day before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. Said you'd know what to do with it." Sam unfolded the letter and read it by the light of the setting sun. It was addressed to him, and it contained everything Thomas had discovered about the rustling operation, including names, dates, and evidence of Sheriff Clayton's involvement. But more than that, it contained a request, a dying man's plea for justice. "He trusted you to finish what he started," Martha said quietly. "The question is, are you strong enough to do what he couldn't?" Sam folded the letter and put it in his pocket. I'll finish it." The truth came to Sam McKenna not with a thunderclap, but with the soft whisper of turning pages in a ledger book that should never have existed. Martha Collins had led him to it, through back alleys and whispered conversations, through a web of secrets that stretched from the sheriff's office to the banker's vault and beyond. The ledger was hidden in Doc Peterson's office, tucked behind bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid in a cabinet that most people would never think to search. Martha had known about it because Thomas had told her, and Thomas had known about it because he'd seen Doc Peterson updating it after one of the rustling incidents, his shaking hand steady for once as he recorded names and numbers that had nothing to do with medicine. Sam opened the ledger by lamplight while Martha kept watch by the window. The entries went back 2 years, written in different hands, sometimes Doc Peterson's spidery scrawl, sometimes Sheriff Clayton's heavy script, sometimes other handwriting Sam didn't recognize. But the pattern was clear. This was the record of a business operation, complete with inventory, profits, and profit-sharing arrangements. The inventory was cattle stolen from small ranchers. The profits were the money made from selling those cattle through legitimate channels to buyers in distant towns. And the profit-sharing arrangements revealed a conspiracy that reached deeper into Redemption Creek than Sam had imagined. Sheriff Clayton wasn't just protecting the rustlers, he was running the operation. Banker Harrington was providing the financial backing and the connections to move the stolen cattle. Doc Peterson was keeping the books and providing alibis when needed. Even Preacher Williams was involved, using his position to identify which ranchers were struggling and might be easy targets. But it was the final entry that made Sam's blood run cold. It was dated the day Thomas died, written in Sheriff Clayton's hand, T. McKenna problem resolved. No further action necessary. Recommend increased vigilance regarding S. McKenna activities. They killed him, Sam said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the lamp flame. We knew that, Martha replied from her position by the window. What we didn't know was how deep this goes. Look at the names, Sam. Look at who's been profiting from this. Sam turned the pages, his anger building with each entry. The Rodriguez spread had been spared because Miguel Rodriguez was paying protection money. The Harrington place was untouched because the banker was one of the ringleaders. Even some of the smaller ranchers were involved, trading information about their neighbors' cattle movements in exchange for being left alone. Half the town is in on it, Sam said. The half that matters, Martha corrected. The half with money and power and badges. The half that makes the decisions while the rest of us just try to survive. Sam closed the ledger and looked at Martha. What was Thomas planning to do with this information? He was going to take it to the territorial capital. Present it to the federal marshal. He thought if he could get outside authority involved, he could clean up this town. Martha's voice was bitter. He was naive enough to think that justice actually meant something. And they killed him for it. They killed him because he was about to expose them. Because he was about to destroy the comfortable arrangement they'd built. Because he was about to prove that the people who were supposed to protect this town were the ones preying on it. Sam stood up, the ledger in his hands. What do you want me to do with this? Martha turned from the window, her eyes hard as flint. I want you to finish what Thomas started. But not the way he was going to do it. Thomas believed in the system, believed that if you presented the truth to the right people, justice would follow. But the system is corrupt, Sam. The people who are supposed to enforce justice are the ones perverting it. Then how? The same way they dealt with Thomas. Quietly. Efficiently. Permanently. Martha's voice was cold as winter wind. They want to play by their rules? Then let's play by their rules. Let's give them the kind of justice they understand. Sam looked at the ledger, at the evidence of his brother's murder and so much more. What did you have in mind? Martha smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Sam had ever seen. I'm going to put the sheriff on trial. And you're going to be the judge. The trial of Sheriff Clayton began at dawn on a Sunday, not in the courthouse but in the middle of Main Street, with the entire town as witnesses and Martha Collins as the prosecutor. Sam McKenna stood beside her, the ledger in his hands and his brother's ghost at his shoulder, as she called the people of Redemption Creek to account for their silence. People of this town, Martha's voice carried across the dusty street like a bell tolling for the dead, we are gathered here to bear witness to the truth about Sheriff Clayton, about the man who claimed to protect us, and about the corruption that has poisoned our community like a cancer. Clayton himself stood in the doorway of his office, his hand resting on his gun, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. This is madness. You can't hold a trial in the middle of the street. I'm the law here. You are the law, Sam said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. But the law is supposed to protect people, not prey on them. The law is supposed to serve justice, not pervert it. He held up the ledger. And this proves that you've been doing the opposite for 2 years. The townspeople had gathered in a loose circle, drawn by the commotion but reluctant to get too close. Sam could see the fear in their faces, fear of Clayton, fear of the truth, fear of what would happen if the comfortable lies they'd been living with were stripped away. Martha began to read from the ledger, her voice steady and clear. Names, dates, amounts. Which ranchers had been robbed and which had been spared. Who had profited from the theft and who had suffered. The mathematical precision of corruption, recorded in black ink on white paper. Thomas McKenna discovered this ledger, she continued. He spent months gathering evidence, documenting the crimes, preparing to bring it to the territorial authorities. And for his efforts, he was shot in the back and left to die in the creek. That's enough. Clayton's voice cracked like a whip. You're making accusations you can't prove. That ledger could have been forged. Those entries could have been made by anyone. Could they? Sam stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. Then explain why Doc Peterson is trying to leave town right now. Explain why banker Harrington closed his office yesterday and hasn't been seen since. Explain why half the men named in this book have suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The crowd murmured, heads turning to look at houses and businesses that had been hastily shuttered. The smart ones had already run, leaving Clayton to face the music alone. And explain this, Sam continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. A letter Thomas wrote to me before he died, describing everything he'd discovered. Written in his own hand, sealed with his own seal, and given to Mrs. Collins for safekeeping. He read the letter aloud, his brother's words echoing across the silent street. Thomas's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, telling the truth about the man who had killed him and the system that had protected them. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Sheriff Clayton's hand moved toward his gun, but Sam's voice stopped him. Don't. You going to shoot me down like a dog, Sam? In front of the whole town? I'm not going to shoot you at all. Sam's voice was calm, almost gentle. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to let you live with what you've done. Let you live with the knowledge that everyone knows what you are. Let you live with the fact that you killed a good man for money. He took the badge from Clayton's shirt, the metal cold against his palm. This town doesn't need a sheriff who's afraid of the truth. It needs peace. It needs justice. And it needs to remember that some things are more important than money. Sam pinned the badge to his own shirt, not as a symbol of authority but as a promise. I'm not taking this job. I'm just holding it until someone worthy can fill it. Someone who understands that the law is supposed to protect people, not prey on them. Clayton stood there for a moment, exposed and diminished, then turned and walked away. The crowd watched him go, and Sam knew he would keep walking until he was far from Redemption Creek and the ghosts that would follow him. The trial was over. Justice had been served. And Thomas McKenna could finally rest in peace. As the sun set over Redemption Creek, Sam McKenna sat on his porch with Thomas's harmonica in his hands. He couldn't play it, had never learned, but holding it made him feel close to his brother one last time. The town below was quiet, cleaner somehow, as if Martha's truth-telling had washed away years of accumulated guilt and fear. Martha Collins had left that morning, taking the stage to Santa Fe with enough money from the recovered cattle sales to start over somewhere new. Before she left, she'd pressed his hand and whispered, "Thomas would be proud of you." Sam hoped she was right. He'd done what needed doing, but the cost had been high. Redemption Creek would survive, but it would never be the same. Some truths, once spoken, can never be unspoken. The real question now was what came next. Sam had worn the badge for one day, long enough to restore order and ensure Clayton's associates faced justice. But the town still needed leadership, still needed someone to stand between the innocent and those who would prey on them. As he watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Sam realized something his brother had always known: sometimes the greatest strength comes not from speaking loudest, but from standing firmest. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, but about making sure the truth is heard. You ever wonder what you'd do if you discovered corruption in your own community? If you found out that the people you trusted were betraying that trust? Would you have the courage to speak up, even if it meant standing alone against the powerful? Thomas McKenna died trying to expose the truth. Sam McKenna lived to ensure that truth was heard. And Martha Collins proved that sometimes it takes a widow to put the powerful on trial. The silence can be more powerful than any gun, more dangerous than any threat. But it can also be the foundation of real justice, the kind that doesn't need badges or courts or official proclamations. The kind that lives in the hearts of people who refuse to let wrong go unchallenged. This was just another story here at Cowboy Soul Stories. If this tale of justice and brotherhood touched something in your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the next story is already waiting in the shadows, and it's going to be one you won't want to miss. In the meantime, remember, sometimes the quietest voice carries the loudest truth. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs to hear.